to Safe Inside, brought to you by TheraTribe. I'm Jeremy Loomis, and these are my conversations with Sandra Fields, an LPC and certified clinical trauma treatment provider with over 35 years' experience helping people who have been through trauma. Welcome back to Safe Inside, podcast brought to you by TheraTribe. I'm Jeremy.
I'm Sandy.
Last time we started talking about the practice acronym, which is a model for the process of working on your healing process as you're making your way through trauma. So we've been talking about creating structure. We went through phase 1 out of 3 phases, so we've covered PRAC, and we're going to finish practice in today's episode.
Yeah, so let's do a little bit of a recap on this. So the PRAC from the practice acronym is the skill building and stability grouping of the acronym. And if you remember, the P is psychoeducation / parenting, R is relaxation, A is the affect control or regulation rather, and then the C is cognitive processing skills. So I think that catches us up, maybe?
Yeah. Well, and if it doesn't, go back and listen to the one before this one. You probably will want a bit of review on that anyways. If you found that anything in this has really rang true for you or really resonated, it's probably worth going over it a second time anyways. But we're going to get into phase 2.
We are, and sometimes phase 2 can take a while to get to because the skills and all of those things really need to be in place. But phase 2 is actually the T portion of the practice, and it is the trauma narrative. In all trauma treatment, there is going to be a trauma narrative. It's going to look a little different depending on what type of treatment modality you use. However, there is always some space in which to talk about the actual trauma, restructure our thoughts around it, for instance, get rid of any self-blame or shame and things like that, desensitize to those memories and sort of reprocess them in a way that makes meaning in our lives going forward, so that we can not step into those avoidance symptoms or responses and not be hypervigilant forever. And we can do all of that, and we can, as we make that meaning and we recontextualize our traumatic memories. And so the trauma narrative is usually the scariest part, but it's usually the thing that people think they have to do right away in trauma treatment. They're like, okay, I've got to go to trauma and talk about my trauma the whole time. Well, no, obviously, since we just went through the episode before this and we talked about all of the other things that we have to do, we also talk about, managing all of those, your affect and your responses and all of that in all areas of your life. Sometimes it's a while before we get to the trauma narrative. The trauma narrative is that place where you literally talk or do something around sort of re-experiencing it to a degree, your trauma. It can look very much like talk therapy, for instance. They may tell the trauma narrative, the clients may tell it, and we may go over and over and over it again. Typically with the TFCBT model for children, that's what we do. Or maybe they will write a little book with pictures. If they're under the age of 5, like in child-parent psychotherapy, which is a type of treatment for children aged 0 to 5, which also works through attachment, the children do play therapy, and they would be encouraged to reenact their trauma narrative through their play. For adults, sometimes the talk therapy portion of the narrative therapy works, but a lot of times if you have complex trauma, it doesn't always. It can make it very difficult. So there are a lot of other ways that we can do trauma narratives. We can do EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. I do a lot of EMDR, and it's a way of processing that trauma, using your biology at the same time and desensitizing yourself to those memories. Some of my clients call it voodoo because the way it works, but those clients have been with me for a while before I do the EMDR I do want to say a side note about EMDR. There are a few therapists out there that only do EMDR. Those are not your people. EMDR is not designed to just be the only thing that you do. You need all of the other things that we've talked about so far, plus some others, to make trauma treatment effective and safe. And so EMDR can be a meaningful addition to full trauma treatment. That's an aside, mostly because I have this hot button around that. But I use EMDR sometimes. I use hypnosis. I do hypnosis for trauma sometimes. I have some clients who are very right brain, very creative, and one of these episodes, I'm sure we will talk about where we store our traumatic memories, which of course would be in our right brain, and how we store them. We store them differently than other memories. But if clients are very right brain oriented, sometimes trauma narratives can be through art projects. I will give you an example of a couple that adults have done. I had one client years ago who had had some sexual trauma. She had had actually a severe sexual trauma, and that did some long-term lasting physical damage. But what she did for her trauma narrative, and she had selective mutism. She couldn't speak because of the trauma. And so for the trauma narrative, what she did was she got a very nice scrapbook book, and she did, each page was a different collage. And so she did a page of how she felt. She did a page, I'm trying to remember, she did a page of the actual trauma itself, including she had a piece of the clothing that she was wearing that she put in there in the collage. She had, I just remember that page, it was very impactful. She had a bottle cap from the beer, the type of beer that they had that night. And she had all of these pieces on this page of the actual trauma itself. And each page was a different collage that had different meaning. How she hid it from her family, that was another page there. And so we got all the way through. And as we went through each page, she and I sat together. She actually was able to start telling me about it out loud. And she hadn't spoken in several years at that, well, I think like almost 3 years at that point. So it was very powerful for her, that release of it. And me going, that piece of clothing that she wore was a piece of mesh. And I looked at that and I said, is this meaningful to you? Do you wonder about what your clothing had to do with this? And she said out loud, yes. And I said, nothing. The causes of rape is not what you wear, it is the rapist. That's the cause of rape, period. Right? And we talked about that, but we were able to go through and so do some of that cognitive restructuring at the same time. So art projects, I have had some clients write songs, and they literally have brought their guitars and things like that to their session and have sung these songs for me, which have been very powerful for me too. Some people are very tactile, and so sand therapy can be very, very helpful for that too, if you have a sand tray or a client that has a sand tray. But when you're doing your trauma narrative, my point being is that it doesn't have to be just sitting telling your trauma. It does need to be individualized for each client. There are some clients who do well with psychodrama. That's another type of way of being able to work through your trauma narrative and sort of change the narrative that you're telling yourself about the trauma. So psychodrama can be helpful. Now, that said, you're not going to reenact, a rape, but if you have complex trauma, you might do a psychodrama around your family, where you have somebody stand in for your father and someone stand in for your mother, and you interact that way with them. That can be really helpful. I've used puppets with adults and not just kids. Has been helpful for them. They were able to distance themselves enough from the trauma to then put it into perspective.
You say distance themselves enough from the trauma to put it in perspective. That's the thing that I wanted to look a little closer at, because it's a very interesting example you give of someone feeling unable to speak. and then using a collage and having that help connect them to themselves, to a part of their own experience in a way that they practically did not have access to before. So what have you seen, since you've seen a lot of this, what have you seen people finding a means of expressing their trauma narrative when it comes to them either diving right in or tiptoeing in? Do people seem pretty cautious?
Well, with good reason. And so, yes, and that's actually, it's funny that you use that analogy, because that's the analogy I use with my clients. When we start talking about trauma treatment at the beginning, and I set them up for that, I use this analogy. We don't just jump into the cold lake. We step our toes into the lake and we wait for our toes to get used to it. Then we step into our ankles and we let our feet get used to it. And then we go up to our knees and we continue doing that, just like we might on a day where the water at the lake is cold, because we're desensitizing to these things. And so I don't suggest that they just jump into it, because that can also be a way of avoiding. If you jump in and overwhelm yourself with the trauma, then you're not actually stepping through it and doing the changing that needs to happen. And so it is a way of avoiding. So yeah, it's this is a process, and it's not an overnight treatment, for sure. Yeah.
An inconvenient, uncomfortable process. Let's draw a line, because I think a lot of people who are going to listen to a podcast like ours are well acquainted with numbness. And I think it would be good for us to draw a line between numbness and desensitization.
Yes, that's true. So numbness is literally what it says. You feel numb towards something. Desensitization means that we don't have those heightened responses to that traumatic event or that memory of that traumatic event. That things that might trigger us, they don't give us that overreaction almost, or that complete underreaction, depending on the type of response. And so it's desensitization in that we don't feel numb. It actually moves the trauma to a place in our past where it belongs. And so we can actually feel more of life. People who have experienced complex trauma a lot of times, and I've said this, I know many times, if you follow us, you've heard it several times, but the range of emotion is shrunk. And so being able to move that trauma in the back and put it in the past and contextualize that and make meaning out of it and bringing it forward that way means that then we can actually feel, we can widen that window of expressions and emotions in a way that life becomes richer and fuller. So it's not a numbness, it's a desensitization to that particular thing. It's like I used to have children in the house when they were growing up, and they were there all the time and they made noises. I was never a type of mom that was like, you had to be quiet. It was, they just did their thing. And most of the time I never really noticed it, unless it got quiet. And then it was like, okay, something's wrong, right? And so I'd go find it. But
someone put someone else in the washing machine or something like that.
So I was desensitized to the sound of the children playing in the house, because I had them in the house all the time, and I learned that this is okay, it's safe, I'm safe, they're safe, unless they were quiet. And putting them in the washing machine is not necessarily out of the realm of imagination for my children. So there was that, yeah. So I learned that as long as the noise was going on, it had a place in my life that I felt safe. And we can do that with trauma. We can have that noise there, but recognize, okay, that happened, but I am safe now. Right now, I'm fine. I am safe in my body. I'm safe in my life. I'm safe in this moment. And so having that noise, desensitizing it, means that I just put it in the past where it belongs. Because trauma responses, we do that because our bodies continue to think that that trauma is happening right now, that it's still happening. And until we desensitize, it's as if it's always happening. And we get stuck in time, is what I tell my clients. And we want to stop that time machine, and we want to get off and live in this moment instead.
And the most commonly that I've heard it described when people are talking about EMDR is filing things away. So it's kind of like instead of having this stack of files on your desk overwhelming you, or maybe perhaps a more poignant example, if you've ever fallen behind on your work emails and you have Outlook, for instance, saying, you haven't responded to this one yet, it's been 3 days. Well, imagine you have 5 of those and they're all saying that, and you still are getting new emails, but at that point, you may find yourself shutting down because you don't have the capacity to take this all on. It already feels like a mountain. It has stopped becoming individual items to check off a task list, and it has become this thing that's bigger than you can face. So when we talk about losing your capacity because all of your inner resources are tied up in this thing that still hasn't had a chance to be filed away and put behind you, it's still this thing in the past that, as far as you and your body are concerned, is still the present. That's sort of what we're talking about.
Yeah, and it's significant. That impact is very significant on your life. So that trauma narrative is important because it really does help put it in the back and give meaning, but in such a way that those distortions, such as this is all my fault, it was what I was wearing, I'm shameful, I'm dirty, I'm all of these things, it's changing those to the truth. It was some person hurt me and this was wrong. Nothing I did deserved it, but it happened, and so it puts it that way. And that's the whole purpose of that trauma narrative. I've seen it work out with children. You could watch them do that same trauma narrative in play over and over again. See them enacting physical abuse, for instance, in the dollhouse with their toys. And you can watch that gradually change as they rewrite sort of that cognitive narrative that they're giving themselves around being safe and being okay and having some agency to say no. And feeling that agency, feeling strong enough to go no, and knowing that you can say no. And I've watched that. I've watched it with many, many, many adults, but it's so visual with those children with the play therapy sometimes that it's kind of miraculous how we can work through those things if we're given the space. So that said, the trauma narrative is something that in my treatment looks very individualized because it depends on the client and what they need and want and what we collaboratively work together towards. I will talk to them about the trauma narrative, the purpose behind it, and then help them decide what kind of narrative process they'd like to go through. Do they want to do EMDR? Do they want to do an art thing? Do they want to write it out? I do have some that like to write. Do they want to write it out? Do they want to write a song? That's going to be up to them, and we step through that. But we reprocess that more than once. Once they do their trauma narrative, we don't just stop at the one time. We go over and over it again until it feels like it's in the right place, until it feels like all of the distortions are now changed to truths, until it feels like it's where it belongs. There's an art to that, as any of those things. Yeah.
Give yourself a bit of grace if you don't see, if you start to see that it is going to be a longer process than you were hoping, because there are a lot of things in life that we think we just need to learn how to do it and then we should be able to do it. But consider just how much a thing, even if it's a cognitive distortion, how much that truly becomes your sense of reality if you've been rehearsing that cognitive distortion in isolation with no one to push back on your sense of that being the truth. If you've stayed in the distortion long enough that it's going to take convincing for you yourself to believe it was even a distortion, then it's going to be a process. And that is probably going to mean you're going to have some therapy sessions that were more beneficial than you knew to recognize they were in the moment.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
So I think we're through phase 2 now.
We are through phase 2. And so the third and final phase consists of the ICE part of the practice. And this is the integrate and combine. So once we've been through all the stability and the trauma narrative, then we want to integrate that into your life and combine it going forward to keeping things safe. So the I is in vivo mastery of trauma reminders, which is a very psychological phrase, I know. But basically in vivo means in the spot, in the real life, right? In real life, if you want to remember it that way, is how I was taught in school, in real life. And so it is being able to master the trauma reminders so we get triggered. We want to be able to master our responses for that in real life and reduce our responses to that trauma trigger in real life. It might be, and these are just sort of residual things. A lot of the large ones will reduce after we do the good work with the trauma narrative, but there may be a few here and there that are not, like they didn't resolve necessarily through that trauma narrative process. And so you want to master that in real life. So if you have, for instance, here's an example, a woman who had been sexually assaulted as a child several times, and then several times by other people as a teenager, and then in her 20s, and now she's worked through all of this. So she's rightfully, in a lot of ways, very paranoid around men, but almost too much so. And so it may be that she works through a trauma narrative and she's like, okay, not all men are that way, even though, that phrase, not all men, whatever, but not all men, right? And so she gets to that point, but then there are certain men, maybe men in power or large men or men with red hair, or I don't know, I'm making up stuff right now. Maybe those particular men who are very specific to her trauma might trigger her more. And so we would do more mastery of that in vivo, in real life. And so that's the I.
And that's a powerful one. I just know, because man, you have to get a lot of education before you can even become a counselor. And after enough coursework, there's a huge difference between learning things in theory and learning things in practice.
Right. This is the part, that's that integrating and combining. So if you've ever been through a class or a training or anything like that, on the other end of it, where you finish it, you do your exam and you walk out and you're like, whatever. And then, months later sometimes, or years later, something clicks into place and you're like, oh, I get how that works now, or I fully understand how that connects. And that's that combining and that integrating that we want to do after the trauma narrative. And so once you do the trauma narrative, of course, treatment is not done because we haven't actually integrated it fully. So this is working on that. And that is the I. The C part is, if you were in TFCPT, this is called conjoint parent-child sessions. And for the kids, this is where the parents would come and the child would read or talk about their trauma narrative. They would go through the completed, reworked trauma narrative with the cognitive distortions that have been changed to the truth. And they would have done all of that. And then we would talk to the parents about their cognitive distortions. Now, that said, what do we do if I'm not talking about parenting, right? Because this is for everyone. For this is where I actually work with, sometimes I bring in partners if that's needed. However, most of the time, this right here is for those that have experienced complex trauma, which is what I mostly work with. This is where we do a lot of that inner child work. This is where we go back and we look at some of the things that child did, and we forgive them maybe for being so reactive, and maybe hold them and empathize with them. That kind of inner child work, that's really highly important. People when they get to the other side of their trauma narrative, a lot of times they look back at their behaviors, their outward behaviors, and they feel a bit embarrassed about their reactions, because they're like, oh my gosh, oh my goodness, look at what I did. And being able to put into context and help them reparent that inner child and give themselves what they need around that.
This stage sounds a lot like the psychoeducation and parenting stage at the beginning.
It is very much like so. But the difference is, at this stage of the trauma treatment, they've been through all of the other steps except for the enhancing safety. And so they understand it fully and deeper, or more fully and deeper, and in a different way. And so this is where we can actually not just educate, but actually do that work of that inner child, where we can really address and love that inner child, and the client can learn to be there to nurture that inner child from here on out, and to keep that child safe and loved, and learn to be their own internal validation, which is a big thing. People, even without trauma, struggle with that in our society today. I see a lot of that lack of being able to internally validate yourself, and everybody looking for it outside. Social media has bought into that, or causes us to buy into that, looking for that external validation all the time. But in this particular stage, it is helping the client grow their own sense of internal validation, so that they're not put in positions where they're looking for validation externally in a way that might make them vulnerable to be hurt again. Which brings us to the last one, which is E. It's enhancing safety. If you have been traumatized, you are much more significantly, clinically significantly, more likely to be re-victimized in your life if you haven't done the work. And part of it is, if you've been victimized as a child, it sort of, I always say, it breaks our safety mechanism. It may be that the kids are reenacting their trauma, or they because of the denial, they pretend everybody is safe when they're not, or they learn that, okay, I don't want to be sexually molested, but if I flirt with this man, I'm forward, I learn to flirt, the flirtatious behavior, I'll at least get some affection, whatever it may be. They're more likely. If we have a girl who is raped, she is 13.7 times more likely to be raped again. That is a significant difference. And so wanting to make sure that boundaries are in place, boundaries are a big part of trauma treatment. I do that all the way throughout, but as we get towards the end of the trauma treatment, it is a really huge focus on boundaries, on the integrity of person, on being able to step fully into your own space, and being able to recognize when someone is treating you badly, and being able to say, this is unacceptable. I deserve better. I am worth more. And so that enhancing safety means that they'll learn to be a little less nice and a little more kind, right, to themselves and to others. And being kind doesn't mean that we just let whatever. Sometimes being kind means calling people out on things, right? It may mean that, no, this kind of behavior is not okay, period. And that's being kind to both. So it's learning to be less agreeable. Especially women, and especially women from the South and some other cultures, being polite, being nice is really hard to overcome. And especially if you were raised in a household where children were seen and not heard, or girls were not valued, or a combination of both, is hard then to know. Or if you're in a workplace and you have a boss who's acting, in unhealthy ways, learning to say, this is unacceptable to a boss, and be willing to stand your ground on that. That takes a lot of inner integrity. And when I say integrity, I mean being true to your authentic self. And so that's the piece that we really work on with that E, to help our clients keep themselves safe going forward. And by the time we do all of that, the ending of trauma treatment it feels a very natural space in which to transition back out of treatment. Now that process, I make it sound, we're taking 2 episodes just to go through the acronym. It is not a short process, especially with complex trauma. People are looking for a quick fix, but if you think about all of the years that complex trauma has happened, and even after you got out of maybe the environment, it was still reenacting itself within you. Think of all those years before. It's surprising actually how fast we can do it, which it usually takes quite some time to do trauma treatment depending on the client. My clients usually stay with me an average 2 to 3 years if they come in with, most of them come in with severe complex trauma. Most of my referrals are from other therapists to me personally. And and things like child advocacy centers and domestic violence shelters. That's for my personal there, or doctors, physicians. So I get some of the cases that are more intense for that, but 2 to 3 years is actually not a bad deal when you think about how many years that they've struggled with this. And it doesn't mean that everything's really bad up to the end of it. It's a process that things start feeling better throughout. Most of my clients think that there's some change each week that they come in, or each time they come in. Some come in more than once a week, but and some come in less now. But they feel like there's some change each time. It may be small, but they can see the change.
And if it's not obvious, we may as well mention now that counseling is like, we'll have people come to us that sometimes really rely on us as they're entering this process. But part of the point of our profession is to leave the clients empowered.
Yes.
So we're actively in the process of training people to be able to own their own life, which means kind of a weaning process. Like, not that we want to rush anybody off, but that by the end of the process, you should need us less and less.
Yeah, I tell my clients that I know that I've done a good job when I worked myself out of a job, right? Because
Right.
we don't want to be needed all the time. And I never worry about my caseload. I always have somebody waiting for that spot. But it is a balance here of making sure that the client is supported as long as the client needs to be, but not so much that they become overly dependent and feel like they have to have us in life. And so, yeah, it's our job to work ourselves out of a job. And that's the thing about trauma, is that it takes away that voice and that agency. And the one thing that, as trauma treatment providers, we want to make sure that our clients have as much voice, as much choice, as much agency, as much autonomy, and as much independence as possible throughout the whole treatment process, moving to full, they don't need us anymore, hope you have a nice life kind of thing. So
Maybe check in from time to time.
I do
if
have
needed.
some, even
Yeah.
from a long time ago, that will sometimes just reach out and say, just wanted you to know I'm still good, things are still great, I'm doing this. And I love those days when I get a phone call or a message or something, and it's like, yes, they haven't needed me for years, but they're just letting me know. I had that happen just a couple weeks ago.
Oh,
And she reached out and sent me a message and just said what she was doing and how she was doing and how she was feeling, and thanking me. She's for holding that hope, was her phrase, because that's a phrase I use a lot. And she's like, when I started treatment, I never thought this would be possible. She says, I feel like I'm out here living my best life, and you held my hope till I could take it myself.
that's amazing.
Yeah, it was I saved that message because I want to have it. But yeah, it's I get those messages now and then, and it's really gratifying. It reminds me of why I do what I do.
Yeah.
It's a cool job we have.
Oh, I know. Some people wonder how we can even handle this line of work, but we get moments like that some people never get to experience.
I love my job. I tell my clients all the time, because they're like, how do you do this all day long? And I'm like, I love my job. I get tired, and I do have days where I feel overwhelmed, but I take care of myself. I'll go get a hamburger, right, with my husband, or I'll go for a walk, or I do something. But frankly, I love my job. I love my clients. I love what I do.
Yeah. You don't have to be in this line of work long before you realize it is not for everyone. But yeah, same.
True.
Same deal for me. So we've talked at length about creating some structure. I'm going to go back to what I said before. You don't start a building project by making a good roof. So if you've ever seen a really shoddy job of some sort of structure that ends up with you cutting your leg open every time you try to walk across that floor or go up a step or walk through a doorway, that sometimes it takes time, and it takes quality craftsmanship is worth is worth taking the time for. So we've talked about the practice model, and that is all about creating structure as you're heading into your healing process. Join us next time as we talk about Name It to Tame It. Thanks for joining us this week.
Thank you.